back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin here with another huge week of World War III analysis. A lot of massive updates on all fronts, really, regarding the Third World War. The huge Trump-Putin phone call is going to be in focus today, as well as some major updates in Syria, the Gaza ceasefire, the Lebanon ceasefire, what's going on in the West Bank as Israel, again, escalates in all directions. A very consistent theme on this show. Turkey, of course, continues its operations in the northeast of Syria against the Kurds and the SDF. Of course, Russia and Ukraine are now moving towards something akin to negotiations. J.D. Vance gave a very momentous speech at the Munich conference discussing all sorts of issues going on in Europe, very much sticking it to the Brussels establishment. But in the midst of the Trump-Putin phone call, of course, everybody is speculating when perhaps one of the leaders, Putin or Trump respectively, will visit the other country to discuss on what is going to happen. You know, Pete Hegseth has openly said that there's no way that the Ukrainians are going to be able to regain much of the territory that the Russians have already taken. So on this episode, Dmitry and I are going to be engaging in some pretty deep discussions and speculations on what we think these negotiations are going to look like and what each side is going to be willing to give up. Of course, that's going to relate to the ongoing nuclear discussions regarding Iran. Of course, Trump talking a lot about Iran's nuclear capabilities, Israel trying to get Trump to allow them to strike. A lot of news coming out about the amount of enriched uranium that the Iranians currently have in their plans for the future of developing these weapons. So very intense episode. Of course, big things going on in Africa, big things going on between Azerbaijan and Israel, all sorts of confirmations in the Senate, Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., and of course, we're going to talk about some ongoing persecutions of the Orthodox Church and many more news items. So it's going to be a big week, but we got to dive right into this discussion on, Putin, Trump's phone call. But before we do that, Dmitry, how are you doing?
Yeah, doing great, Conrad. It's been an intense week, a lot of diplomacy, a lot of big moves in international relations. And, we have to just recall exactly 17 years ago, on the 10th of February, Vladimir Putin gave his famous 2007 Munich speech, which essentially restarted world history, you can say, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse, the dissolution of the USSR. And so we can kind of look at that as a hallmark date. And today, definitely history has flipped the page and we're in an entirely new chapter. Many say this is of course, the gateway to the multipolar world, and others, of course, such as our show, we are stating that the entrance to the multipolar world scenario in international relations will, of course, open with most likely a very hot conflict, and which I believe will be the Third World War. So here in the show, namely, I think we'll discuss the particular statements made by Donald J. Trump, and of course, his most important phone call, I would say, of his presidency thus far, with Vladimir Putin, which lasted approximately 1.5 hours. So just about the duration of a World War Now podcast episode, if you can imagine Donald J. Trump, just like me and Conrad, discussing, of course, geopolitical events here, and him and Vladimir Putin focusing primarily, I believe, on Ukraine and the potential of a peace treaty, or how exactly could the future borders of Russia and Ukraine look. What exactly they discussed, of course, was not disclosed in full, except Donald J. Trump left a very sort of amicable remark. He's essentially stated that Vladimir Putin has a very common sense approach to things. And exactly Donald Trump's discussion was probably confirmed by the new Defense Secretary of the United States, Pete Hegseth, who in a press conference essentially openly stated that Donald J. Trump is willing, and the administration of Washington, D.C. is willing to, of course, look at it very soberly at the entire Ukraine situation. Nothing really is off the table. And of course, what could this mean in particular? We can, of course, only presume that the future negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, with the US being sort of the middle person, or perhaps the defense attorney of Ukraine in these future discussions, they could be convincing Ukraine to give up or legitimize the referendum in Crimea, for example. That's a very key event, which again, Crimea until today is still considered occupied Russian territory, only de facto, not de jure, under the control of the Russian Federation, as well as some of the other eastern oblasts, in particular Lugansk and Donetsk, which Russia, I think, will not be ceding at all to Ukraine in any capacity in any future discussions. So I think there's a lot of speculation here open on the table. At the same time, of course, we have that massive, just as I said, the Munich speech of Putin. This was the equivalent of J.D. Vance giving a speech in Munich just yesterday, and that was, I think, very eventful, only because J.D. Vance especially aimed his criticism not at the Russian Federation, not at the enemies of America, and he didn't even placate, say, Iran or North Korea as these threats to liberal democracy and Europe. He essentially aimed at the internal enemies of Europe. He blamed in particular mass immigration. And again, J.D. Vance is a very shrewd, skilled politician. We do know the people behind him, these Peter Thiel characters, in support of Elon Musk, these massive technocrats. Who knows what exactly their objectives will be? I think we discussed on AFR with our good friend Anthony of Westgate, exactly what are the objectives of these new US bureaucratic tech bro elites. But J.D. Vance has made it very clear that Europe itself needs to introspectively look within and reform itself, that freedom of speech is at risk, that Europe has been weakening and destroying itself. And he came across as someone who's willing to, of course, continue the massive NATO defense alliance with the US's strong participation. There's no real indication at the moment that Trump is going to dissolve NATO in any capacity, but they're looking at the European Union and these countries of Europe as essentially someone compromising their own positions, especially when it comes to their own domestic policy, but also in terms of foreign policy. What values are they promoting in countries abroad, and how exactly are they weakening their own nation through mass immigration? And in some ways, I think a lot of the audience at Munich, Conrad, were very liberal Europeans. We know that the majority of European bureaucrats, like besides the certain key figures that we discuss here in the show very often, they do support the replacement of the European population. For whatever reason, the European population has been blindly voting them in. And with the looming elections in Germany, with the AfD, of course, most likely winning that election or potentially winning many, many seats in the German Reichstag, there is this assumption that perhaps the Europeans will finally strike back with the support of the Trump J.D. Vance administration and win some sort of prominence. And we're speaking, of course, about right-wing conservative Europeans. So a very promising week in terms of, well, maybe the world will be saved from the upcoming world war, but at the same time, there's all kinds of speculation about exactly what Trump is willing to do in order to make these concessions to the Russian Federation, because it does seem like Vladimir Putin is not really willing to give up Russia's advantage at the moment. And Russia, make no mistake about it, is advancing all across the front lines. There's big, of course, victories in terms of diplomacy. BRICS is looking very strong as a sort of multilateral forum for economic development for these Atlanticist countries. And it does appear that Russia has all the chips in its favor. It has survived the sanctions, and the future doesn't really rely on its cooperation with the US. It's simply optional. And so at this point, we have Donald J. Trump really coming down from his high horse and frankly giving a call to Putin. Potentially even there's speculation that Trump may actually visit the Russian Federation for the first time. And it'll be years since the president of the United States has visited Russia. I think that would be a big move towards a potential discussion for peace between the nations. But at the same time, we have to keep in mind the international community is very much split on exactly what the outcome will be for Zelensky, because he has been signaling some pretty toxic things recently, especially given Trump's strange statements, right? We can't just, of course, give all the props to Trump for being this peacemaker. Trump has made some very bizarre statements in regards to Gaza in recent weeks, as well as statements in regards to Ukraine. And again, this probably caught my attention very strongly, Conrad, the fact that Trump said that Ukraine will need to repay the US and all of its allies over $500 billion in terms of, for all the support that it's been provided over the last few years, and essentially just stating that, well, look, he's signaling to Ukraine, if Zelensky does not follow the US's lead, the US will file the bill. They will flip the bill, give it to Zelensky in Ukraine, and Ukraine will need to pay it off. How realistic that will be? I think not really. Ukraine really, under Zelensky's leadership, with the arrogance that they've displayed, with the outright terroristic acts that they've committed on the territory of the Russian Federation and even abroad, we can say Nord Stream, we can look at the different pipelines, even going to Turkey and their own so-called allied countries and neutral countries being affected. The Ukrainians, again, shipping explosives all across, all around the borders of the Black Sea and trying to blow up the Kerch Bridge. We'll see that Ukraine really is not a favorable sort of partner to negotiate with in this particular manner. I don't think Ukraine will essentially surrender its interests if Donald Trump continues this very strong rhetoric. And frankly, the most worrying thing about this $500 billion reparation that Trump is speaking about, this massive bill that Ukraine will need to pay, is that, well, the eyes of Trump are, of course, on these rare earth minerals that are apparently found in Ukraine. And Ukraine will pay not through some sort of fiat or financial means, but it will be paying through by allowing the US to collect these minerals. And of course, the funny element of this entire debacle is the fact that Zelensky in front of a few journalists, which we posted on our Telegram, has pointed to the map of Ukraine and stated that most of Ukraine's best earth minerals are found in central Ukraine, which is currently, of course, under the siege of Russia and in a very dangerous zone, as well as in the east, in the Donbass. And Zelensky has said, well, if Trump would like to, receive the sort of payment from Ukraine, we're going to need to take back eastern Ukraine again. And we know that this is absolutely not on the table. And most likely Trump, as well as Pete Hegseth, has signaled that not only will Ukraine not be able to join NATO, not only will aid be audited very heavily, but also there's probably no chance of Ukraine ever reestablishing its full territorial integrity as it once had in 1991. And from there on in until, of course, 2014 and the late 2013 Maidan. So I think that's a realistic sort of look. And we have to just keep in mind, Donald J. Trump is first and foremost here advocating for American interests first, but also the interests of potentially other parties, which we'll discuss towards the end of the show, that sort of dark Zionist lobby, which potentially has other interests in the Middle East and in New Khazaria, which is today Zelensky's occupied Ukraine. So a lot of interesting events this week, Conrad, in diplomacy, and J.D. Vance again showing himself to be that sort of up-and-coming, real patriotic American politician, as much as we can say. He doesn't necessarily fit our characteristic of the best conservative, the most reactionary right-wing politician, but he's making some strong statements, and I think the anti-immigration rhetoric is quite admirable.
No, I completely agree. I just want to remind everybody, of course, like this episode. It helps us out a lot. I know here at the beginning, a lot of people will be listening. So if you want to help out the show, even if you're not behind the paywall, be sure to give us a like. It really helps us out. And if you do want to support us financially, be sure to check out the link below and try to listen to our latest Ether Hour episode with Gregory. Here's all about the life, reign, and legacy of St. Constantine the Great, the first Christian emperor, the legalizer and evangelist of Christianity across the Roman Empire. The whole episode, of course, is behind the paywall, so you'll get access to that and, dozens and dozens of other episodes, well over 60 episodes of Ether Hour behind that paywall at this point. So some amazing content about some saints, about all sorts of historical items, as well as some of our takes on controversial issues, some amazing content. So be sure to do that, support the show. But back, of course, to the World War III analysis. You're completely right, Dimitri. Obviously, J.D. Vance's discussion of the immigration issue in Munich is important. He made reference to the very recent terrorist attack in Munich itself that I think one person so far has died from. It was some Afghan migrant who used a Mini Cooper of all vehicles to run over 25 plus people, I think, and, dozens injured, which is horrible. And this is a person who had already had his asylum claim rejected. So why he was still in the country, I guess, is beyond me. But no, you're completely right about what Hegseth said as well at his press conference. He also said that there will never be American troops in Ukraine, and there will be no Article 5 and no NATO peace mission in Ukraine either, as far as the rest of that press conference went. So this is very much against the sort of NATO EU bureaucrat perspective on how this should be handled. Of course, we had Kaja Kallas, German officials talking about how Ukrainians all need to be represented in these negotiations, kind of signaling that they don't like Trump just overstepping all of Europe and Ukraine and going directly to Putin, which, of course, that's exactly what needs to be done. We don't need the input of people like Boris Johnson or Baltic leaders who have no interest besides, operating on behalf of the Jews in their ethnic resentment against Russia. We know Boris Johnson is the reason why the Istanbul agreements that were initialed by the Ukrainian negotiators completely fell through and were reneged upon, is because Boris Johnson flew to Kiev and pressured Zelensky and told him that he would have unconditional support from the Atlanticist power bloc. And, we're experiencing this today. Putin and Peskov and the other officials in Russia have signaled that they don't view Zelensky as any kind of legitimate leader that can be negotiated with or spoken to. And I think this is funny because, we had some interviews with Zelensky. This is from Dave DeCamp. He says, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said Thursday that it was not very pleasant that President Trump spoke with Russian President Vladimir Putin a day earlier before calling him. We've already had 3 conversations with President Trump, so I don't take this call as a priority that he spoke to Russia first, although it's really not very pleasant in any case, Zelensky told reporters while visiting the Khmelnytsky nuclear power plant in western Ukraine. As for the conversation, he knows my thoughts. I really believe that Ukraine is the priority first and foremost. There is a war against us, he added. The call between Trump and Putin marked the first time in 3 years that the leaders of the U.S. and Russia held a publicly known phone call. After the conversation, Trump said negotiations to end the war would start immediately, and then he called Zelensky. The Kremlin said on Thursday that Trump and Putin both offered the other to visit their respective countries, but that a summit in a third country would happen first. And of course, they say this is going to happen in Saudi Arabia. Zelensky has said that he won't meet with, I think, Putin in Saudi Arabia. Of course, J.D. Vance is talking with Zelensky in Munich, which has already been discussed. And Zelensky says he's going to try to reassert all of his priorities, which involve hundreds of jets and all these crazy equipment demands, because his claim is that Ukraine will need to have one of the world's largest militaries if NATO membership is off the table. So they need to be outfitted to completely go after Russia in a full war, as it were. So I think this starts to raise the questions of how serious is Zelensky and how likely is it that Zelensky is even going to be the person that is making the calls on behalf of the Ukrainian people when these negotiations do come about. Because from Putin's perspective, I could see how Putin would very much, like to meet with Trump, signal all these things, and ultimately just continue advancing. All sorts of unbiased, sources say that Russia continues to increase its military capacity by hundreds of thousands of troops, seemingly in an attempt to make more efforts on territories like Kharkov and, of course, to regain the rest of Zaporozhye, Kherson, oblasts, and perhaps even going farther than that. And I personally don't believe that the current line will be everything that Putin demands. Of course, Trump could make him an offer he can't refuse. Of course, Trump, great negotiator. I don't know exactly what situations would need to arise for Putin to go against the Russian constitution, for example, and allow some of these oblasts to be cut in half. But remember, even Kharkov still has a Russian military administration. There are a few villages still there controlled by the Russians. And of course, the Kursk situation, I don't think Putin would ever enter into any kind of negotiations while the Kursk situation is still unresolved, because that gives the Ukrainians a big negotiating chip to say that, we retreat from Kursk as long as you retreat from, any number of places. I don't think Putin wants that type of negotiation to be exactly what is going on. But we're obviously going to talk a lot about Russia's moves in the Middle East regarding Iran in a second. But let's just talk about what actually is going to happen when negotiations start and how long you think it's going to take and what conditions on the ground need to be met for Putin to do that, as well as just probably taking us through a frontline update across all of these regions, because the missile strikes have dramatically increased across all of Ukraine by Russia. And the advancements, Ukraine have made some successful counterattacks in the Pokrovsk front, but Russia and other areas of that same front have continued to advance in that cauldron, and more cauldrons are emerging every day in these regions across the front that Ukraine is simply unable to contain. So what exactly is going on the ground, and how is it going to affect the future of these negotiations?
Yeah, of course, Russia's making some pretty severe pushes, and there's a lot of firefighting taking place at the moment just next to Pokrovsk, which is the city we've been covering for a few weeks now, perhaps months. We know that Russia's advancing towards Pokrovsk, and it wants to take it not through a head-first type of approach like in Avdiivka or Bakhmut, for example, but in a more, shall we say, in the least bloodthirsty fashion, which is essentially a surrounding of the city, forcing the Ukrainians to surrender after a few weeks of besieging them, taking out the aid and support and logistical assistance they may receive from the outside, which unfortunately in Bakhmut and Avdiivka, as we may know, did not take place. So essentially Ukraine kept supporting the defense lines, fighting against the Russians, and it turned into what is now essentially colloquially known as the Ukrainian war meat grinder, right? And in Pokrovsk in particular, the Russians are advancing on the western side whilst holding strong positions on the east. They're trying to surround Pokrovsk from essentially both directions, but now at the moment, Ukraine is really trying to push Russians back towards the west. So Pokrovsk really is the upcoming massive siege and battle that I think we'll see in the coming weeks, probably irrespective of if these peace talks take place or if they're delayed in any capacity. Russia, again, is making really swift advancements. As we discussed last week, Toretsk, which is just north of Donetsk, and it leads up to Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, these two such important key cities in the Donetsk Oblast, which is still occupied by Ukraine. Toretsk has been completely captured by Russia. Now Ukraine has admitted that. And the Russians this week have been just clearing out basements, underground parking lots, etc., essentially doing the dirty work of mopping up and forcing any Ukrainian resistance cells still operating within the city. If there's any Ukrainians who didn't get the memo that they've left the city, it's time for them to surrender. Again, very difficult sort of operations, clearing out those basements. There may be booby traps, grenades, all kinds of things. Mining operations. Some of these Ukrainians are so fanatical that, frankly, they'll probably meet death like proper Viking Valhalla Banderite soldiers instead of surrendering. So it's really concerning. But the Russians are currently clearing out all of those remaining Ukrainians in the now occupied and liberated Russian city of Toretsk. So that's really good news. And especially in Kursk, we see the same sort of thing. The village of Sverdlikovo was liberated by Russia. There's been a lot of reports that from all the villages that Russia has liberated in Kursk, if there were any survivors on the ground, sort of living under Ukrainian occupation for more than 150 days now, they've been reporting Ukrainian war crimes, for example, the mining of wells, the shooting of civilians who happened to just walk outside of their country homes or tending to the animals, feeding their sheep, pigs, etc. outside. Ukrainians would just start shooting them at them from afar with sometimes rifles, other times just shooting them with tanks, things like this, just incredible reports. And Maria Zakharova actually mentioned that one of the most egregious crimes in the Kursk Oblast was that there were actually World War II veterans who were killed. And one in particular was tortured before he was killed in his own home. And there's a photograph of that. His body, of course, left unattended, unburied, already sort of rotting in the kitchen, or, just the really unseemly sight. And again, Russian World War II sort of propaganda narrative really is aided by these sort of crimes committed by the Ukrainian Banderites. They really don't understand exactly what they're doing and how they're provoking a stronger Russian reaction for committing all these crimes. And this week in the Kursk Oblast, it has been a bit quieter than the previous week in early February, when the Ukrainians failed their assault, trying to push the Russians back out of Sudzha, again failing, losing tens and tens of armored vehicles, etc., and equipment, which is all Western made, of course, and provided by NATO member countries. So that's incredibly considerate. And you did mention these long-range bombardments of Kiev and Russian territories. The Russians have reported that between the 8th of February and the 14th of February, so just today, the Russians have shot down 725 Ukrainian drones. Just consider that's almost 100 drones a day. Insane. And if you can consider that's just the drones shot down, how many actually made it through? We're talking about over 1,000 drones flying at Russian apartments, military objects, etc. So Ukraine is mass producing drones. Of course, we know that Ukraine is buying drone parts and electronic components from countries like Turkey and China. Yes, that's, of course, China, a member state of BRICS, but of course, China sells to both parties, Russia and Ukraine, in this conflict, not actually selling the drones in their completed form like the Shaheeds from Iran, but they're actually selling parts, in Alibaba style, like wholesale, which Ukraine, I'm sure, is happy to buy through the aid and the finances provided to it by the US and by the European Union countries. So that's quite unfortunate that there is this sort of oversight. And Russia at the moment is just not in a bargaining position to tell China off for selling all of these parts through business sort of contracts to the Ukrainians. So this is something we just have to keep in mind. Again, China economically is such a powerhouse. Russia is not able to really censor it in any capacity or even provide any sort of open criticism. It's not in a position to do so. And this is part of the larger sort of theory crafting on the show, is that, again, as Russia distances itself from the EU and the US and it sort of gains independence, it does become economically somewhat tied by this invisible tether to China economically. And unfortunately not India, because India, as we saw the meeting between Modi and Trump, is very much in that Zio-US camp, right? And of course, India's collaboration with UAE, the Mumbai-Dubai underwater connecting highway train track project, as well as the IMEC, which I think is a really big deal, will of course tie India a lot closer to these countries, which are very US aligned. These are the Arab Gulf countries, and of course their main collaborators in the Middle East who have promoted, again, this weird Wahhabi Sunni Zionist alliance, the Gulf states. So sort of in the long run, I think Russia will definitely benefit by staying sort of in strong collaboration with the BRICS countries, but it needs to keep in mind not all of the BRICS countries have the same interests, as we see in South Africa with the white genocide currently being promoted by both Kirill Ramaphosa as well as other parties like our favorite Jackson Hinkelstein type of communistic South Africans who want to come to power and essentially enforce some sort of ethnic cleansing of the white Boer Afrikaner population. So incredibly concerning that BRICS really does only tie countries today through economic collaboration. But heading back to Ukraine, Russia, again, the most interesting thing is there was another exchange of Ukrainian bodies or Russian bodies. And again, the ratio is incredibly off, right? It's over 700 Ukrainian bodies of deceased Ukrainian soldiers for roughly, I think, 45, maybe 50 Russian deceased soldiers. Again, it's either the Russians are not dying in this conflict at the same rate as Ukrainians, and all the information provided to us by the Washington administration of Trump, where Trump says 600,000 Russians have died so far, it's clearly not the case. And these official exchanges of corpses and bodies really shows that, I think. And that's the stark reality on the ground, is that a lot of these Ukrainians are under-equipped, definitely undertrained, and they're being sent into essentially meat grinders on all fronts, right? And even, except of course, front lines such as Kherson. In Kherson at the moment, the Dnieper River really provides this natural barrier. Ukrainians are protecting, I think, both sides, both the Ukrainians from having these suicide charges into Russian villages, as well as, again, the Russian villages themselves from outright Ukraine assaults and potential war crimes, as we see in Kursk. So that's a curious thing, like in Kherson at the moment, Ukraine is continuing to long-range artillery bombard Kherson villages, which apparently have Russian troops stationed in them. So it's very Zionist Israeli fashion where they bomb villages south of the Litani River, and of course they claim Hezbollah is hiding in them, or it's similar to maybe the IDF bombing apartments in Gaza, claiming Hamas is hiding in the basement, right? It's a similar sort of fashion. So they bombed 65 times 11 villages just on the borders of the Dnieper there. So a lot of villages, again, being forced to move further inland, I think, Kherson. And this leads Conrad into the wider conversation about where exactly the borders will be drawn if the future peace treaty through mediation or conference will take place, with the US, again, arguing on the side of Ukraine, be it in Saudi Arabia, which I think is a fairly good neutral country. We understand it's very US aligned, but at the same time, Saudi Arabia hasn't negatively impacted Russia in a very explicit way. Like, we know Saudi Arabia has stopped really counter-signaling the President Assad government around 2017 and 18. We know that the UAE and Qatar were the main sort of parties responsible alongside Turkey to cause the downing of that particular regime in December last year. And Saudi Arabia has not really impacted Russia negatively in terms of raising or lowering the prices of oil, which it has a huge holdover. And so the Russian economy has benefited through this weird collaboration of Saudi Arabia recently. And I think that particular kingdom is a potential middle ground. Unlike Turkey, I would say Turkey and Ankara is really not the place for Trump, Putin, and say Zelensky to meet up in the future. And Saudi Arabia, it does have this air of neutrality to it. And again, you have these Islamic holy places there, which kind of give it this air of sort of spirituality that there can be a lasting peace achieved. The reason why I say this is because Donald J. Trump, he's made it very clear in his domestic policy that he's actually actively going to drain the swamp this time around. There's a lot of people being fired. We know that USAID has been completely reformed, if not completely obliterated. There's, again, all kinds of changes as to how the US will approach its border with Mexico. There is strong tariffs. Trump is making a clear statement that he's willing to not just have short-term peace treaties for some sort of political gain, but he's willing to make long-lasting changes. This is probably one of his objectives. And he wants the Ukraine-Russia peace treaty to be a long-lasting one, not just one for 3 months or 6 months. And in saying that, that only benefits Russia in the long term, because perhaps Russia could request control of cities such as Kherson. The reason why Kherson takes precedent over Zaporozhye in any future discussions of peace treaties is because the people of Kherson actually had a mini referendum similar to Crimea, where they actually voted at some point to join Russia. Kherson arguably is more pro-Russian than Zaporozhye. And in fact, the Russians liberated Kherson at the beginning of the SMO. The only reason they left is because Ukrainians were approaching, and the commander of the Russian forces, Surovikin, as well as most likely Shoigu himself, actually made the decision to cross to the right side of the Dnieper and essentially protect.
Well, remember, Zaporozhye had the same referendum those oblasts did, but Zaporozhye city itself simply wasn't able to vote in it.
Exactly. So we don't, arguably we don't know, but we have to keep in mind the Metropolitan of Zaporozhye is arguably Metropolitan Luke is the most based Ukrainian hierarch around at the moment. So that's an interesting factor. And it would be very sensible if Trump did propose these new referendums in the two cities, which arguably are in the Russian constitution and now essentially occupied Russian Federation cities. So that would be an interesting argument. But generally speaking, Russia, again, is progressing. It has the momentum. It's had the momentum ever since the Kursk debacle. Yes, the Kursk Oblast would entirely need to be cleansed of any Ukrainian presence, but Russia at the moment has certain chips in its favor. But what would the Russians actually sit down at the table for? I think most importantly, and this is what the Russian oligarchs are probably vouching for here, Conrad, is the lifting of the majority of US sanctions on Russia. I think that is something that Russia will strongly argue for in this particular case. Yes, a lot of the European Union, a lot of these countries are strongly anti-Russian, including the United Kingdom, the Baltic states, etc. They're very strongly anti-Russian. They most likely will not be lifting any of their sort of local bilateral sanctions against Russia. But the majority of the US sanctions, if Trump is willing to lift them, as well as recognize some of these oblasts officially and we have to remember international relations recognition of certain new states. It may seem somewhat trivial, but in the 1800s, this was part of how international relations even worked. Post-Napoleonic Wars, when Greece gained its independence from the Ottoman Empire, all the other nations of Europe gathered together and they generally recognized Greece as a final independent state. The same thing happened in Bulgaria and in other countries. So it does mean a lot if Donald Trump was to recognize Donetsk, Lugansk, Crimea, maybe entirety of Kherson Oblast and partially that of Zaporozhye, to claim that that was Russia. I think this would go a very long way. And perhaps this is something that Putin would naturally sit at the table for, and as well as a permanent guarantee. And now that Pete Hegseth has confirmed that Ukraine will never join NATO. But mind you, Zelensky's claims, right, his demands for foreign aid are very specific. We actually have numbers here, which are completely insane. I'll just read them out here. Zelensky states that if Ukraine does not join NATO, Ukraine will require funding from the US and NATO countries, so similar to South Korea and Israel in a way. The Ukraine will take this sort of similar position where South Korea and Israel are not NATO member states, but they receive a huge amount of funding from these countries. He stated Ukraine requires 220 army brigades, totaling 1.5 million troops, and enough aid to keep this army running, a gigantic army, one of the biggest in Europe, considering probably larger than the Russian army, fully equipped with NATO weapons, 150 modern Western aircraft units, so helicopters, F-16s, everything, and as well as dozens of air defense systems. So these are Patriots, THAADs, which cost $1 billion American dollars each. Again, these demands are absolutely insane. And we do know that Zelensky officially at Munich, when he pulled J.D. Vance aside and they had that discussion about Ukraine's minerals, Zelensky did not sign a document signing over 50% of Ukraine's minerals to the United States for exploitation and gathering. So very interesting. Zelensky makes these huge demands and yet is not going 100% Larry Fink, BlackRock style, and handing over all these wealth that Ukraine definitely has. And it belongs to the Ukrainian people, frankly, and the Russian people living on the land, to these US corporations and these private companies which work with the American government. So very interesting. I think Donald Trump is actually approaching this in a very serious manner. I'm very hopeful that he is actually willing to make big concessions towards Russia. And potentially, the only thing that's not discussed again is the persecution of the church, the position of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, because as we'll discuss at the end, the Russian Orthodox Church is not actually willing to completely lose influence and control over its Ukrainian diocese, because we have to remember these are all of these dioceses in Ukraine ultimately are not even under Metropolitan Onufriy. Technically, their patriarch is still Patriarch Kirill of Moscow. So we'll discuss this towards the end. But generally speaking, some pretty incredible moves in the Russo-Ukrainian war. And for the first time since the beginning of the war, the Biden administration again has failed all these discussions. We finally see like a window of hope, right? We see rays of light coming through that maybe there'll be some reprieve and, people can finally grieve the dead and there'll be an opportunity for both sides to actually reassess exactly what has happened in this post-COVID new World War III reality that we live in.
Really quick, before we move on to the Levant and everything, we have to also assess the future of the leadership of Ukraine itself. And I think the question of the map will depend a lot on Russia's soft power, how it affects the future of regime change and, palace intrigue going on in Kiev itself. And then I think how far they decide to take that as far as their territorial expansion will show how serious they are, I think, as a civilization state, as a state that is prepared to confront, what we have reported on the show as the prophetic realities of what is to come, which we think is a confrontation with Turkey, which will ultimately result in them having a full military presence, entering the Levant, confronting, multiple NATO countries. Again, NATO could not exist in the future, but confronting the West, confronting the United States, even potential issues with China if things go a certain way we've warned about. And I think if Russia is unwilling to press and take all of the Black Sea coast of Ukraine and connect with Pridnestrovia, I think that shows that they're not as serious as I think they're going to need to be to face the trials that the forces of evil are going to throw at the Third Rome. So I think it's very important that I think Putin should, and I think he is going to delay these negotiations until they secure more territory, until they perhaps establish more and more of a bridgehead and more front lines within territories like Kharkov, perhaps establishing more of a buffer zone. Because look, if you're, just reclaiming Kursk Oblast within Russia, I think you need to be pressing, into Ukraine, much farther to at least prevent that from happening, establishing a buffer zone there, which ultimately, again, I think you should be holding referendums in these areas. And if there's political turmoil, then that would be very likely. I'm going to read this from Slavyangrad. It says, Ukraine continues to mop up supporters of the Party of Peace and all people who can compete with Zelensky. Back in 2022 to 2024, all supporters of negotiations with Russia were in the SBU's custody, and now there is a purge of people who can compete with Zelensky. In particular, the National Security and Defense Council has already imposed sanctions against Poroshenko, who we know as Voltsman, detained people of Klitschko. So multiple Klitschko supporters have been, detained and arrested. Also, the oligarchs Pinchuk and Akhmetov. This Ukrainian inside is of little interest to our audience, but it clearly shows that Zelensky is what Zelensky is trying to achieve. So Zelensky is clearly afraid of all sorts of political opposition. And I think eventually, if the Russians we've seen more and more Russian, people getting arrested by the SBU, supposed Russian double agents within the Ukrainian forces. So I'm assuming the soft power from the Russian side is increasing as well. And I think political turmoil within Ukraine is going to be something that the Russians view as a necessity to dramatically escalate before they enter into any kind of negotiations with the United States in some third country, with perhaps a country like Saudi Arabia helping negotiate. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on the future of Zelensky's succession and how you think leadership issues in Ukraine could affect negotiations before we talk about the situation in the Levant.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the conditions that Russia may propose to Donald J. Trump and even the Ukrainian government in this particular case would be a re-election, right? A re-election in the Rada, a return of all the sanctioned politicians, including maybe Viktor Medvedchuk, who was, again, a very pro-Russian politician who's now living in Russia, is a good friend of Vladimir Putin. He was, of course, arrested at the beginning of the SMO. A return of all these politicians to the Ukrainian political arena. Now we're looking at, again, Ukraine with 1/3 of it belonging to Russia and the borders of which, as you said, are at the moment a bit ethereal in this sort of drawing. Again, this will depend on Russia's successes in the coming weeks and months probably. But again, a return perhaps of Valery Zaluzhny, who has a reputation of being actually a successful Ukrainian commander. Like, a lot of the blame falls on Syrsky, but Zaluzhny actually arguably has some pretty decent military knowledge, because he was actually in charge of the Ukrainian counteroffensive after the initial success of Russia. He's the one who pushed Russians out of Izium, pushed Russians back out of the Kharkovskaya Oblast, and of course, he is the liberator of Kherson from the Ukrainian perspective. So Zaluzhny returning from his temporary exile, from being the sort of ambassador-type figure to the UK, I think is a potential actor who may go against Zelensky. Remember the triumvirate at the beginning of the SMO: Zelensky, Zaluzhny as the head of the military, and again, the head of propaganda, the Ukrainian Goebbels in a way, Alexei Arestovich, who's teacher with a Kabbalah teacher, is the Ukrainian red pill coach, right? And Alexei Arestovich, he may pull some strings to even return himself to the Ukrainian political sphere. So Ukraine will turn into this Thomas Hobbesian sort of a man is a man's wolf scenario, where you'll have all these toxic Jewish, Ukrainian, as well as Shabbaskoy politicians fighting one another. I'm not sure exactly how this will benefit Ukraine in the long term. And I think that Putin is actually willing to have Ukraine turn into this another cauldron of weird political alliances and machinations just to have Zelensky lose some of that power. Again, I stated this on a recent X space, but one of the things that goes in Zelensky's favor, and one of the reasons why he has such authority in today's politics, is not even his ethnic background. I think that has more to do with the globalists having a certain control over him and his deeper allegiances. But the fact that Zelensky somehow managed to guarantee literally hundreds of billions of dollars in funding of credit and these weird loans of strings attached to Ukraine, which no other political leader, including Petro Poroshenko, Voltsman, who at the moment is protesting Zelensky's government very intensely in a hilarious way. So Poroshenko's party actually, during one of the Rada conferences, they took the seat of the Speaker of the Ukrainian Parliament of the Rada out of the meeting room, and Zelensky's Jewish Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal actually mentioned that, well, the Speaker doesn't need a chair. The chair is just symbolic. The Speaker can speak standing up, so the Rada hearing will continue. So it's a complete circus. The Rada, as we've seen all those fighting and punch-ups take place there in the early 2000s, the same thing is happening now. Poroshenko is being tried as well. There's criminal trials against him that will have their final hearing sometime in April. So we'll see some massive changes in Ukrainian politics going into April. But yes, I think Putin may want to throw the wrench into Zelensky's sort of his image as this fighter for Ukraine and fighting off the second most powerful military in the world, holding off against them for 3 years, which, as we've discussed recently, is almost the duration of certain countries' participation in the First World War. It's pretty insane. 3 years is a very, very long time. And so I think Putin will want to, Putin has a personal gripe against Zelensky, the fact that he disrespected him openly. And we know that Putin has these like personal hang-ups with people. It's just simply the nature, as we saw with Prigozhin, of course, and other people who've perhaps offended him personally, such as Alexei Navalny. So I think he really doesn't want Zelensky in power any longer. And I think he'll be willing to bring in these alternative oppositionary politicians into the realm of Ukrainian politics once again. Except my thesis, I think, Conrad, would be that this won't necessarily benefit the Russians living in Ukraine, and especially Orthodox Christians, because most of these politicians, all these people I mentioned, even if they're liberal, right-wing, or Alexei Arestovich, sort of centrist figures, they're all very tied into the cabal, the greatest sort of Talmudic conspiracy of Ukrainian control. They're all different flavors of the new Khazaria that Ukraine is supposed to be, this new grain hub, as you said, not just for Turkey and Africa, but for the future Third Temple Kingdom of the Moshiach in Israel. And that's the project that Ukraine is sort of planning it out to be. It's just who will be the manager in charge of that project. Will it be a Zaluzhny, Arestovich? Will it be a Viktor Medvedchuk, perhaps? Or will it be a Zelensky? I think this is the unfortunate reality, is that all these people need to be cleansed out of Ukrainian politics. We need to bring back real right-wing Ukrainian Russians like Pavel Gubaryov or even Oleg Tsarev, people who actually care about the greatest civilizational battle, or even people like Igor Strelkov, for example, who actually care about the future of Christian civilization in Europe and Eastern Europe in particular.
Unfortunately, we lost some great heroes like, Kirill Stremousov when we did retreat from Kherson, which was, a lot of great people who, forced the frontier to where it is today have faced the consequences. Stremousov, others who have been killed, and of course Strelkov, who is still in prison for a few more years. But, Zelensky recently in Munich, he said, "I don't think that the U.S. has a ready plan to end the war." He talked about holding his talks with J.D. Vance and said, "I will visit Saudi Arabia, but I will not have a meeting with Russia or America there." So clearly the Saudis are more interested in facilitating talks with, people that actually matter, like Putin and Trump, not necessarily the Jew Zelensky himself. But, moving down to the Levant, of course, the Saudis seem to be emerging as the most, not necessarily because they're good people, but just due to circumstances as the greatest peacemakers. Of course, the Qataris, the Emiratis, and the Turks decided to move in to Syria. Of course, Israel is, no friend of peace. They are deep in the Greater Israel Project. And of course, Jordan and Egypt are reeling from the possibility of taking all these Palestinians. The Saudis are the ones that seem to be. And of course, the Houthis, the Yemenis have picked their side. That's no question at all. But the Saudis seem to desperately be wanting to. They met with Jelani, al-Sharaa, as he's now being called. And of course, they're trying to facilitate these normalizations, perhaps between Russia and Ukraine. But Russia's, involvement with Iran is ultimately going to be what makes the potential Israeli strikes on Iran that are being openly discussed right now so interesting. And this recent headline from Haaretz, ties in the Russians, the Saudis, the Israelis. The headline is, "Netanyahu plans to attack Iran and is plotting to lure Trump into the war. By attacking Iran with or without the United States, Israel's prime minister seeks to turn the October 7th calamity into an epic strategic triumph. Will the Saudis help Trump avert this?" And we do know that Trump has a very close relationship with Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudis. And with Jared Kushner and the Abraham Accords, they were desperately trying to bring them into the fold with Israel. But Saudi Arabia was the first to say that they have no interest in going along with Trump's plan of relocating the Gazans to specifically Egypt and Jordan, as we discussed. And Trump, in a recent meeting with the Hashemite king of Jordan, Abdullah, he said, he's 99% sure they'll come to a deal with Egypt. He convinced the Hashemites, the Jordanians, to take in 2,000 cancer-stricken children in Gaza. And of course, Trump views this as, sort of an open door to eventually taking more and more Palestinians. In that same meeting, Trump also said that he thinks the annexation of the West Bank by the Israelis is going to turn out really well, which again, I don't think the Jordanian king wanted to hear that, because people are talking about Gazans. I think Trump's vision actually has the Egyptians taking all of the Gazans and the Jordanians taking most of the Palestinians in the West Bank, which both Jordan and Egypt, I know, have no interest in doing, because they know that would mean likely the end of their governments. Like al-Sisi has talked about major militarization of the Sinai Peninsula. And Again, Jordan, already majority Palestinian country with millions from the West Bank going in, that would lead to an overthrow of the Hashemite kingdom there as well. So the Saudis, very much becoming a central hub for all of this. But the news of the Iranian strikes, rather the Israeli strikes on Iran, is everywhere. Though Trump supposedly had a meeting with the Israelis about these strikes directly, and Israel knows that if they do what they do and strike, the deep mountain bases of Iran, the seven, if they did a kind of shock and awe strike on all 7 or 8 bases that have enriched uranium that do the different elements of the Iranian nuclear process, they know that the United States would basically be forced to throw their weight behind them because they know Israel would be facing a apocalyptic, catastrophic strike and threat from the Iranians in response. So obviously this is an extremely dangerous situation. We're seeing a dramatic increase in the amount of Russian flights to Iran, Iranian flights to Russia. I'm assuming a lot of this is air defenses. A lot of this are, Suka-35, new Russian 5th-generation fighters that are coming to Iran as well. But at the same time, Dimitri, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this before we discuss the other situations, specifically the Gaza ceasefire, the Lebanon ceasefire, and, all of the fronts in Syria, which continue to escalate. I want to know, what is this call to the Russians that they had with the Israelis about the Iranian nuclear program? We hear that, Iran is enriching more and more uranium, but that the Israelis don't want to allow Iran to enrich any uranium. They want that to be one of the tenets of a future deal, a disarmament of Iran, which again, we know that the Israelis are just trying to foment regime change and escalate to get to a war, but they're going to put ridiculous demands on the Iranians so they can claim that they, attempted negotiations. But I'm wondering your thoughts. What is this Russian call? Because my fear has always been that the Israelis rather also have an interest, and perhaps they could be influencing the Saudis to do this as well in toning down the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Because look, Zelensky is a Jew. He's never going to go against Ukraine. And if Israel can sort of support Russia in its signaling towards peace, they perhaps think they can secure support from both Ukraine and Russia, which at this point are both very strong military powers in their own rights, to secure their support in a future conflict with Iran. And, you can connect this to Azerbaijan, which we're going to talk about Russo-Azeri relations in a little bit. But Dimitri, what happened with this call? What were the Russians and the Israelis talking about in regards to Iran's nuclear program, considering that, Russia is basically Iran's closest ally?
Well, here, I'll give these two potential scenarios. One is optimistic, one is more pessimistic. Okay, so the beginning of the optimistic one, Russia at the moment is probably the only country, the only world power, member of BRICS, member of the Security Council of the UN, that can guarantee some normalization and perhaps de-escalation between Israel and Iran, simply because of Russia's ties to both these nations. Again, unfortunately, closer ties to Israel perhaps than even to Iran, besides, of course, the recent defense agreements. But we understand the rabbis, Ber Lazar, Alexander Boroda, etc., and Chabad itself has very strong ties and some sort of control over the Kremlin. We're not even sure. It's kind of a little bit, it's not very palpable exactly what kind of strings they have attached, but we know a lot of Russian elites do have family living in Israel. And so these Russian officials speaking to the Israeli diplomats, I think the guarantees that they can provide of Iran's de-escalation of its and militarization of its nuclear facilities is simply in that, well, or there are probably Russian scientists and engineers working, from Rosatom, working by contract and with the assistance of the Russian Defense Forces in Iran at the moment in these underground facilities. As we discussed earlier, this is a huge consideration. It's one of the black swan events that could take place if Israel strikes against these nuclear facilities, killing Russian experts. We understand Russia is, and we talked about this in our special A4Hour episode discussing BRICS and Russian energy. Russia is the leading expert at nuclear energy at the moment, and nuclear uranium enrichment in particular. And Rosatom is one of the only, in fact, it is the only Russian state-backed agency, department, essentially, that hasn't been sanctioned by any country. In fact, and that's really interesting. It's almost as if the world wants Russia to develop these new nuclear technologies and sort of export them. Perhaps they want to steal their secrets in the future. But Rosatom essentially, not only is it building these big icebreakers in the north, but it's also building these portable nuclear reactors, building more foundational nuclear reactors of a high technological grade. And it's very interesting. So maybe Russia's making these guarantees, telling Israel, look, you don't have to worry about Iran. We're helping them build simply nuclear reactors for energy purposes, not weaponry, right? So that's one particular case scenario. And again, the reason why US cannot play this middleman role between the two nations because the US is so deeply anti-Iranian and has been since 1979, and simply it's simply a biased member state. There's a conflict of interest, of course. US, the Zionist-Israeli relations are essentially so close that really Iran can't trust the United States, but it can trust the Russian Federation, Russian politicians, which I think can be maybe seen as dangerous from a very deeply Persia-first perspective, right? If you look at exactly what happened in Syria and the Bashar al-Assad regime, right? And the pessimistic scenario, Conrad, I think it's worth mentioning that the greatest Talmudic debacle that we may even see in the 21st century yet, worse than the Iraq War, 9/11, et cetera, and all these other provocations, maybe even worse than COVID, would be a grand exchange on the chessboard of Russia essentially giving up Iran to Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the US, and retaining or taking control of the majority of Ukraine in exchange for that, which is why the Ukraine de-escalation is on the table, and the Iran-Israel escalation is simply, not only is it on the table, but the Israeli rhetoric is continuing to be hawkish against Iran. And even today, like they're stating that apparently the Beirut airport has been shipping in weapons from Iran. So you know how we spoke about the weapons, of course, being shipped over by land, by trucks and stuff through Bashar al-Assad's controlled Syria to reach Lebanon from Iran. But now they're claiming that there are straight up like planes arriving in the Beirut, the biggest airport in Lebanon, and just bringing in weaponry, explosives, and equipment to fund and to build and strengthen Hezbollah in Lebanon. So Israel is very, very hawkish in regards to Iran and any of its allies, be it the Houthis or Hezbollah in the north, all these Shia-related groups, and even the Sunni Houthis in particular, those who are, again, in favor of the dominant Iranian presence in the Middle East as being sort of the fair sort of Muslim first perspective here. So this is the pessimistic outlook, is that Russia is trying to weigh up its options. And the Russian diplomats, and again, we have to kind of look soberly at this, that there is a potential that just like in Syria, where Russia was, for whatever reason, forced to abandon its positions, and now there's a big discussion. There is the Khmeimim and Tartus, this issue is not completely resolved. There's been some weird HTS opposition blockades of Russian equipment from Khmeimim further south towards Tartus, and essentially these big Russian military trucks have been forced to turn around mid-journey by these weird Syrian former al-Qaeda terrorists, and they're just simply pointing fingers, telling the trucks to go back. Can you imagine? Hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equipment, and then they just get stopped in the middle of the Syrian coastline and forced to turn back. I mean, it's humiliating. It's an embarrassment for Russian foreign policy, but that's where Russia stands at the moment in Syria. And so looking at the greater picture of exactly how the Third World War will develop in the Middle East, I think there is this scenario wherein the leadership of the Russian Federation, not the Russian people, but the leadership may be willing to, in order for, again, in favor of dropping the sanctions, normalization of the West, may sacrifice Iran as a potential pawn. Iran's really not a pawn, but it may be viewed as a knight or a bishop in this particular geopolitical chessboard, and they may sacrifice it in order to normalize, to regain some of their economic relations with the West. And this is, again, very pessimistic, but we have to keep a sober outlook. And this is, again, the thing that argues against the pessimistic outlook here, Conrad, is the fact that we do see a continuance of trade between Iran and Russia very actively. Like we did see those Iranian planes fly to Russia, and vice versa. The Ilyushin planes continue to arrive in Tehran and other military bases and airports in Iran. So Russia and Iran are very close. They're only strengthening their relations, and they have over the last year. So hopefully this will go a long way, and Russia simply does not abandon its newly gained ally, who, frankly, before, during the USSR, Iran was very anti-Soviet, but now with this new democratic Russian Federation, finally, the normalization between the Shia Persians and the Russians has sort of turned a new leaf, and hopefully this will continue going forward, because the pessimistic scenario, I don't think anybody wants to see it, because we know what comes next. And next, it's a full-on assault against Orthodox Christianity in the Middle East, potentially further into Eastern Europe, and a huge war with Turkey and the Turkish belt. Who knows what will happen? It would be generally very apocalyptic for the entire region.
Well, from the pessimistic perspective, let's think about what Russia potentially has to gain from allowing, the West and those to just completely rape and balkanize and have regime change and completely neutralize Iran as the regional power. They seek to gain, of course, relevance in Ukraine, they could perhaps gain a lot of their demands if they, behind the scenes, world Jewry, I'm sure, is literally working on this. If they, sort of make demands behind the scenes and give things up, perhaps they could have a more maximalist, advantage in Ukraine. Think about soft power in Belarus, perhaps. The West could tone things down in Belarus. We know Lukashenko is very close with the Azeris, and the Azeris are, of course, no friends of the Iranians. The Georgians recently expressed how close they are with the Azeris. So think perhaps, what if Russia also seeks to gain full soft power influence in Georgia? Of course, the Georgians are discussing how they need to get Abkhazia and South Ossetia back before they resume negotiations and relations with the Russians. But let's say Russia could just do that, but then have Georgia completely within its sphere of influence. I fear that Russia might be willing to take Belarus, Ukraine, Georgia, maybe a few other places, again, maybe maintain their bases in Syria, have good relations with, of course, Jolani, or as he's now called, Ahmed al-Sharaa. Of course, Putin had his first phone call with the interim leader of Syria, in which Putin confirmed Russia's readiness to help improve the socioeconomic situation in Syria, including providing humanitarian aid to its residents. It was agreed to continue this type of useful contact to develop a broad agenda for the development of bilateral cooperation. As impressive as it may seem, Putin also wished Ahmed al-Sharaa success in resolving the challenges facing the country's new leadership to the benefit of the Syrian people and all this sort of stuff. And people, on this post from Bellum Acta, it's reminded that al-Jolani led an al-Qaeda branch in Syria and military operations against the Bashar al-Assad regime and the Russian army since 2013, with HTS also harboring Chechen terrorists whom fought against Russian army in the Caucasus and in Ukraine for decades. So again, with all of this happening, and again, with how Russia did allow Syria to fall in the first place, I fear that pessimistic perspective is necessary, and we do need to explore the possibilities. And hopefully, of course, Russia sees that the situation is dire, and again, that they perhaps are starting to understand the Turkish threat, because the Turks have no interest in seeing the Iranians survive as well. That Russia realizes, no, Iran is a critical wall that we can't allow to fall, and we will support it, as much as we can, which, again, if Russia's going to use its influence on the Israelis to prevent things like that from happening, that would be great. But I don't see that happening at all. I don't think the Israelis are going to listen to Russia, of all people, about toning things down with their, new Hitler-esque boogeyman. But speaking of Syria, of course, and the Turkish issue, this is from Jason Ditz. It says, Syria warns Kurds will be excluded from national dialogue if they don't disarm and submit. The fighting between Kurdish SDF and the forces of Turkey and its proxy, the SNA, continue apace in northern Syria with no signs of ending. Turkey targeted civilian infrastructure, leading to power outages and water cutoffs for some 100 Kurdish villages around Tabqa. Turkish interest in Syria is driven by the Erdogan government's desire to tamp down on Turkish autonomy in the region. Turkey is pushing the new Islamist government to do more against the Kurds, and the Turkish Defense Ministry has offered to relocate Turkish ground troops into northern Syria to that end. So far, the al-Qaeda-linked Hayat Tahrir al-Sham new government in Syria hasn't moved militarily against the Kurds directly, but it has repeatedly denounced the idea of Kurdish autonomy and is stepping up the rhetoric. The Syrian government has issued a statement warning that if the Kurds don't agree to disarm and submit, they will be excluded from the meetings on national dialogue between various Syrian parties. The meetings are meant to produce a statement related to the eventual creation of a constitution. The spokesman of that national dialogue committee, meanwhile, has insisted that the Kurdish SDF do not represent our people, and that only groups that the HTS believes do represent Syria will be allowed to participate. Turkey is keen for the new Syria to eliminate all autonomy, particularly of the Kurdish sort. In the past month, Turkey has threatened a full invasion of Syria if the SDF isn't totally eliminated. Turkey has also urged the HTS government to take control of the ISIS prison camps in the northeast, which are also run by the SDF. Groups within the Kurdish autonomous government in Syria, the AANES, have emphasized the importance of their ability to continue protecting their rights within the new Syria. This includes ongoing training exercises for their fighting forces, which runs contrary to Turkey's vision for the region. The AANES, however, aren't focused exclusively on armed resistance to Turkey or exclusion from the conversation on where Syria is going. The group is sending representatives to the Munich Security Conference scheduled for this weekend. And of course, the Kurds are, always protected by the West in a lot of ways. They're the reason that the U.S. still has a presence in the region, which, of course, last episode we discussed Trump discussing pulling all of our forces away, which again would be a major victory for the Turks. And I don't know exactly how Turkish lobbyists are, talking to Trump about this. I don't know if the Israelis want that. That would be I don't think they do. Obviously, the Israelis, they support the Kurds as well. And the Israelis, I know, would like to control the Druze regions as well as have a sort of, I think the Israelis would like a Kurdish autonomous region spreading across Syria and Iraq, because that would weaken, pan-Islamic unity, which is often united against Israel. But as far as other things going on in Syria, the Israelis have continued to take more and more territory. They now hold the most territory they ever had, hundreds and hundreds of square kilometers in the Quneitra region outside of, the U.S. recognized Golan Heights, which is still internationally recognized as part of Syria. And Trump and Hegseth have openly said that they are willing to, enforce and protect Israel's buffer zone for really as long as is necessary. And again, we know the Turks are also all across the north in the Alexandretta region and all of the northeast now, well across the Euphrates. And I don't know if Turkey has any overt annexation plans. It wouldn't surprise me. But Syria, of course, is, the reason that they are talking about excluding these Kurds from the negotiations is because they are trying in vain to keep the entire country unified despite Assad's fall. And for the first time since the fall of Assad, we finally got what appears to be a legitimate explanation of what exactly happened from Hafez al-Assad, Bashar's son, who basically recounts that there was no plan and that the initial plan was to keep fighting and there was an address planned by Bashar and that they planned to fight. But once they saw that Homs had fallen much quicker than they had ever anticipated, or rather it was Hama, I believe, or I can't remember which city it was, but well after Aleppo had fallen, the next major city that fell, I think Homs and Hama, they realized that it was over. A Russian soldier came and told them it was best to go to the base in Latakia. They went there. Things continued to escalate and many retreats occurred. And then ultimately in an unplanned way, he talks about how he communicated with some of his cousins who they said were escaping a different route. And I think those were the cousins that ended up being killed. But he goes on to say that ultimately we were then evacuated to Moscow in a military plane, and that's how it went down. And of course, he had even taken a video to prove that he was in Damascus, mere hours before this ended up happening. So I think the story is legitimate. However, Elon Musk immediately banned his account on X, which I'm not sure why exactly he did that. I don't know which, interest group wanted that to happen explicitly, but that was interesting to say the least. But unfortunately in Syria, while Russia might be able to maintain its bases, it seems that the new government there still is very interested in persecuting a lot of these minorities because they are fundamentally, as I said before, al-Qaeda Islamists that are much more interested in this, Sunniism enforcing their little zone than they even are, confronting Israel and the Zionist entity, which continues to expand literally into their territory. However, we have seen more, not very often, but some infrequent exchanges of fire, mostly the Israelis striking certain HTS groups. And again, we see little flare-ups of, Alawite resistance, but it's really not very substantial. The main fighting, of course, is still ultimately between the Kurds and the Turks up in the north. However, last week we did talk about the border clashes between the pro-Hezbollah clans and the Syrian government. Of course, Israel also did a lot of strikes on those pro-Hezbollah clans, and a lot of the Lebanese ceasefire seems to be collapsing. We're going to talk about some protests in Lebanon in a second. But regarding Greater Israel, Bezalel Smotrich, Israel's finance minister, he did reveal the end game for Judea and the West Bank this week. He said, Tulkarm and Jenin will look like Jabalia and Suljaya. Nablus and Ramallah will look like Rafah and Khan Yunis. And, major escalations are going on all across the West Bank. From Yahoo News, bulldozers tore everything apart. Israeli raids expand in the West Bank. The raid, which according to Israel aims to dismantle terrorist infrastructure, has targeted Palestinian refugee camps in the northern West Bank, including Jenin. But since it began on January 21st, the deadly Israeli offensive has gradually encroached upon more cities and towns. So again, at this point, I think it's happening southwest bank. I've seen videos of Israeli troops advancing in Palestinian Jerusalem. I've seen videos from Nablus, from outside Jenin. Of course, I think at this point it's over 100,000 Palestinians in the West Bank have been displaced. So this is truly just a soft version of the Gaza invasion. It just wasn't preceded by a genocidal air campaign. And of course, we do obviously have to talk about the Gaza ceasefire. And this is from antiwar.com. Hamas says it will release 3 hostages on Saturday, signaling deal might be back on track. For those that don't know, Donald Trump said that unless all of the hostages are released by Saturday, that the deal is done. And, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have signaled this. They've always said that we only agreed to the one part of the deal. The 3-part ceasefire is nonsense. It was never actually agreed to. But again, I think there are negotiators that are trying to keep it alive. I'm going to keep reading here. Hamas said on Thursday that it plans to release 3 Israeli hostages on Saturday, as agreed under the ceasefire deal. And Israel appears to have backed down on its demands for more captives to be freed. The Times of Israel reported that Israel is preparing to receive 3 hostages on Saturday, despite Prime Minister Netanyahu backing President Trump's threat that the genocidal war would be restarted if all hostages weren't released. Earlier this year, Hamas said it was postponing the hostage release, citing Israeli ceasefire violations, complaints that Israeli officials acknowledged were legitimate. Hamas's main gripe appeared to be over Israel blocking tents, mobile homes, and construction equipment from entering Gaza. According to Middle East Eye, dozens of bulldozers and caravans entered the Egyptian side of the Rafah border crossing and are expected to be allowed into Gaza. Egyptian officials told Reuters that Israel would let heavy construction vehicles enter Gaza in exchange for the hostage release happening as scheduled, but Israeli officials denied the report. A spokesman for Netanyahu said that there is no entry of mobile homes or heavy equipment into Gaza, and there is no coordination for it. So, of course, they continue to explicitly restrict aid. Ben-Gvir has talked about how we need to bomb aid trucks going into Gaza. So, very reasonable people we're dealing with here, obviously. But It appears that certain Israeli forces are more interested in keeping the ceasefire going. I think that's largely because at this point they are reshuffling for what could be imminent, I hope not, but it could be imminent strikes on Iran. And I think at this point, if that goes on in the Gaza situation, they'll probably just be able to do whatever they want amid the fog of war. Not that that's funny, but that appears to be what could go down. But the other situation, of course, is the ongoing protests in Lebanon, which the claim in, mainstream media is that pro-Hezbollah forces are blocking the road to the airport. They're protesting against the suspension of flights from Iran to the Beirut airport. So again, the Sunnis and the Maronites and the Christians are experiencing a very big political victory right now, as Hezbollah, of course, has been heavily, heavily damaged by the Israeli strikes. And of course, this suspension of sort of flights between Iran and more relations between Lebanon and Iran are deteriorating the status of Hezbollah. Of course, the takeover in Syria has damaged a lot of their supply routes on the ground. And the only place left, I think, ironically, where there's going to be a lot of sympathy could be in Iraq. And, again, those supply routes are also disrupted. So the mainstream media was talking about how all these protests that are, disrupting day-to-day life in Lebanon are by Hezbollah supporters, but Hezbollah media quickly came out and said, no, these are provocations that are being blamed on us, and they don't have anything to actually do with us, and trying to basically tone it down because I think they thought it was bad optics or whatever. I don't know if it's true or not, but in general, Lebanon is experiencing a lot of turmoil, but the U.S. is explicit in saying that they're very committed to the February 18th deadline. This is from Middle East Spectator. General Gasper Jeffers of the U.S. Army, head of the Ceasefire Monitoring Committee in Lebanon, says the Lebanese army will take control of all the remaining villages in southern Lebanon by the February 18th deadline on Tuesday. General Jeffers, however, seemed to use vague language, implying that while Israel will indeed withdraw from the population centers, the IDF may remain in some unpopulated areas of the Lebanese border. If this is the case, it is once again a violation of the ceasefire terms, and it risks downplaying the Israeli occupation of Lebanese lands if the Lebanese government agrees to the state of affairs. So, again, everyone's trying to tone things down across the whole region. I think I fear that there is becoming an understanding that the strikes on the Iranian nuclear capabilities are just coming and that these other sort of loose ends need to get wrapped up. But again, the unity among the Islamic world against the expulsion of the Palestinians from Gaza, outside of the UAE it appears to be standing strong. Turkey apparently says they have plans on the ground to counter this if it attempts to go forward. I don't know exactly what that means. We do believe a lot of this from Turkey is mostly talk, but, as far as the future of the region, it's really anybody's guess at this point. And, Hamas claims to have been completely replenished as far as the amount of fighters that they have go. And of course, al-Houthi himself has said that if fighting continues in Gaza, they're going to, escalate their strikes on the Red Sea and on Israel itself again. So, unless you have anything to say about, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza, the West Bank, Dimitri, we do have to talk about what's going on in Africa.
No, absolutely. I think it's really clear to me now that regardless of what the eventual outcome of the ethnic cleansing, whichever kind of color or flavor it takes, of course, with the leadership of President Trump, it's clear that Hamas will definitely be the enemy number one. Marco Rubio made that clear when he made a statement on his ex-account, Department of State, where he essentially stated Hamas is evil, it's pure evil. Notice the sort of dehumanizing, very powerful, almost theological type of rhetoric here. Even Russia didn't use that sort of statement when addressing, say, HTS or any of the groups that took power in Syria. So it's very clear that the United States has cemented itself as the main enemy of Hamas. It's like, we're not the enemies of the Palestinians, we're the enemies of Hamas in particular. And Marco Rubio's soon-to-be visit to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, will, of course, only cement this particular alliance that the US, I think, will have in cleansing Hamas out of the Gaza Strip. But as we spoke about last week, Conrad, everything is aligning here. It's just that US, I think, sees its main priority in demilitarizing Gaza, similar to how Russia's priority was to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. The US, I think, working for Israel, working with Israel in conjunction, they're going to work towards the demilitarization of these militant Palestinians who have probably lost relatives, ancestors, and, of course, loved ones in this generation-long conflict with Israel. This is why most of these people join the, you can say, radical Sunni organization of Hamas in the first place. It's simply because circumstances in life life tragedies force them into these particular cases, not because they want to, say, genocide the Israelis. I think that's probably the strongest case for understanding why Hamas does what it does. It's simply a fight for survival. And the organization itself was essentially created on the basis of liberating Palestine from the river to the sea, etc. And I think America understands this, which is why it is directly working with Israel to both counter-signal Hamas as well as label them as the primary enemies that need to be taken down. While we're still in the Middle East, Conrad, I do want to mention the strange happenings between Azerbaijan and Armenia. I guess it ties very closely to Israel because Azerbaijan has signed a new energy deal with Israel. They're working very close together. This relationship, as it sours between Baku and Moscow, between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem and Baku, is actually strengthening. And that's quite bizarre because this new Turco-Zionist alliance, right, despite the fact that we did talk about a potential scenario of Turkey and Israel coming to a confrontation, in Syria, there could be a potential division of Syria between these two spheres of influence. There'll be a northern, the majority of Syria will fall under the arbitration of Turkey, whilst the southern parts of Syria, especially those lands adjacent to the Golan Heights, will be, of course, under the patronage of Israel and going into the future. What I'm saying is that lands will be occupied by Israel indefinitely, frankly, probably since the Old Testament times, you can almost say. Like, none of these lands really belong to anyone claiming to be from the 12 tribes of Israel for this long. And we do see interesting moves again in Azerbaijan, Baku, where the Azerbaijan branch of Sputnik, the Russian news channel, which has been sanctioned in the West, has ceased operations. But I guess on the positive side, you did also have BBC of Azerbaijan, which is, again, from the UK, who was funded by US aid, probably related to US aid funding actually being cut, also ceased operations in Azerbaijan. So Azerbaijan is making big moves in terms of its soft power influence, exactly what kind of influence other nations have in its country. We did see some positive statements from Georgian politicians stating that Azerbaijan is a key ally in the region, in the southern Caucasus, that is, on the coast of the Caspian Sea, and in that sort of land bridge between the Caspian and the Black Seas leading out into the Mediterranean. Again, Azerbaijan is really putting itself into this strong position. And the really bizarre thing is they're not just resorting to really hawkish military rhetoric. Azerbaijan actually has taken Armenia to the Hague Arbitration Court for, guess what, not military war crimes or anything of that sort. No, for environmental damage to Azeri land. So in fact, they're striking on multiple fronts here. And probably the biggest story in relation to Azerbaijan-Russian relations, Conrad, is that, again, President Aliyev and the Azerbaijani government has accused Russia of lying about the plane that was shot down next to Chechnya, which was flying from Baku to Grozny. There is this general assumption that the plane, again, was shot down. Again, it landed in Kazakhstan on the other side of the Caspian Sea, but there was a general assumption that it was an accidental anti-air missile strike from a Russian system, which was positioned north of the Caucasus Mountains. But at this point, instead of, say, blaming some sort of trigger-happy Dagestani or Avar or Chechen, the Russians simply have not really openly stated exactly who was at fault. And I think the Azeris have taken it very personally because there were Azeri citizens on that plane who died. And I think Aliyev is using it to the fullest extent. This ties into the story from last week where Aliyev has blamed Armenia for not keeping up with the sanctions against Russia. And at the same time, we did see Pashinyan has taken on a new look. We can say almost Putin-esque, like a Prigozhin style, clean-shaven, completely bald, this new sort of realpolitik, geopolitical 21st century look. And this new sort of clean-shaven babyface Pashinyan is now openly stating that he's willing to, again, sit down on the table with Azerbaijan to discuss some sort of joint projects with Iran to normalize relations. And I think he's doing this out of pure fear, both domestically for his own sort of political future as well as for the future of Armenia generally. I think he's understanding finally Finally, he has attained wisdom, Conrad, and he's realized that Azerbaijan continues to arm itself, continues to trade with Israel in terms of military experience, information, and technology. And Azerbaijan is powering itself up for a potential third Azeri-Armenian war that we've seen in recent decades. And the conflict will again reignite at some point into the future. And there's really no guarantee of an Armenian victory. We know that France is again assisting Armenia. We know that Azerbaijan has accused France of providing Armenia arms without any sort of formal defense treaty. But at the same time, Azerbaijan does have the support of a much stronger and closer ally in the face of Turkey. And there is that futuristic project of like a Turanian-Turkish belt, which again should choke out not only Christian countries, but even this, I would say, kind of a rogue state in the face of Armenia. Armenia is viewed, I think, they're trying to blame Armenia. They're trying to label Armenia as the state that really should be under the influence of Turkey and should be potentially split up into the future. The other, I think, strong argument of why Azerbaijan is counter-signaling Russian media is because Russian media and there are a lot of Russian celebrities, and the Russian media is strongly controlled by Armenians. Funny enough, in Moscow, for example, many of the producers and directors of really quite degenerate, but I would say very modernistic 21st century TV shows and movies are actually Armenian producers. The Andreasyan brothers, for example, they've recently released that new TV show in Russia, which promotes the race mixing between Africans and Russians. So there's a lot of weird, potentially non-Armenian, by the way, they're like Armenian Jews. Hypothetically, there is a long-standing conspiracy that there's a sizable portion of Armenians who aren't actually Armenians, but they're a potential derivative of some sort of Sabbatean or Khazarian Jews who migrated to the region. We know Armenia is one of the most anti-Semitic countries in terms of the world and the region, generally speaking. So Armenia could be punished for this by sort of world jury for holding these sort of strong Christian. We spoke about this in our episode with Gregory Hears, that Armenia was one of the first Christianized countries. In fact, it was the first kingdom in the world to Christianize, and it took very strong anti-Talmudic, anti-Jewish positions very early on, around the time of Constantine the Great and the First Council of Nicaea. And for this, I think that country and this particular civilization is viewed in a negative light. And we have to keep in mind, Azerbaijan is not just Turkish elites which hold power in this particular country. It is the Mountain Jews, right, which hold a significant influence, and Aliyev himself has intermarried with these people. So this is like the greater scope, and probably explains why Azerbaijan is really taking this hawkish position both towards Russia and Armenia. I think in the long term, it's generally probably civilizationally centuries-long punishment which is coming for the unfortunate Armenian Christians who have such a, well, arguably ineffective leader like Pashinyan, who has placed this country at jeopardy. So there's a lot happening there in the Southern Caucasus.
No, I completely agree. And again, the Georgia situation, while Russia again continues to be making, kind of soft power sphere of influence moves there, the Azeris they've clearly emerged as the most powerful of the three little kind of Caucasoid, near the Caspian, between the Black Sea, that zone. They've emerged as the leaders. And of course, they have the highest population, and they, I think have been damaged the least in recent wars. So I guess that makes sense. But you spoke of the sort of Turan, the pan-Turkic region stretching from, Western China all the way to Turkey and the Bosphorus. Well, Erdogan himself was just in Pakistan, meeting with the leaders there. And I'm sure, shoring up his support, and shoring up the, perhaps Turkic identity there and his support among this future Ummah, this future Islamic constituency that he perhaps is trying to appeal to. But we do have to move on to talking about Africa, where the war in the Democratic Republic of Congo is dramatically escalating. The M23 Rwandan militia group now controls a territory within the DRC that is 33% the size of all of Rwanda. We know Rwanda is a very small country, but it's still crazy that they're able to control this much territory very quickly. There's video of the Burundian military fleeing from Kavumu, which is just north of the major city of Bukavu, which was also taken by the M23 militia. So Burundian forces have retreated. South Africa continues to say that they want to send troops to the Democratic Republic of Congo to defend against Rwanda. Chad has said they want to send troops there. And of course, we know that those Romanian troops that got captured were ultimately, I think at one point, were operating in Chad as mercenaries there. But because of all of this, the Democratic Republic of Congo's president, Tshisekedi, which I think sounds weirdly Georgian, ironically enough, will no longer attend the African Union Summit, which again, that's the big regional, the EU attempt in Africa, of course, where everybody talks about these things. So he's having to stay behind because of the war. And there are now rallies in support of M23 in all of these regions. So it appears that, if Rwanda wants to annex this territory or whatever the future comes, it appears that there is local support for all of this. And the local governor of Bukavu, so not just the city, but the entire region, he fled the entire city. So at this point, the Rwandans and their supporters are going to be able to probably install a local government and everything. So I don't know if there's going to be any Western commentary on this as it continues to escalate. Of course, Rwanda has very good relations with a lot of other Western countries because they're a stable African country that produces things and, has even offered to take illegal immigrants and refugees that get sent, that rather go to Europe and then get sent to Rwanda. So perhaps Rwanda saw that they had a lot of bilateral movement relating to, how they could act against these less stable countries around them. But other things going on in Africa, of course, the Sudanese civil war has also escalated with the junta, the SAF, winning a lot of big battles against the rapid support forces who are really only backed by the United Arab Emirates. They have even, put forward prosecutions against the UAE and the international courts for backing the RSF, who have very tangible evidence of war crimes committed against them. They committed some really enormous massacres, in the outskirts of Khartoum and other places. So I'm glad that Russia is dealing with the SAF. And the big update, of course, is that they've now officially reached a deal, the junta in Russia, on a Russian port on the Red Sea in Sudan. And of course, I think that could lead to Russia helping them sweep up the RSF issue much quicker. And I'm glad that that is happening, because I don't support the Russians and the Emiratis having close relations, because like we said before, the Emiratis have been the first ones to sell out the Gazans and the Palestinians. They're the most supportive of Israel, and they are, of course, also heavy supporters of the IMEC corridor, which is in the news today, of course, because Trump met with Indian President Narendra Modi, and they explicitly reiterated the importance of this IMEC corridor. This headline is from moneycontrol.com. Greatest trade route in history. Trump-Modi reaffirm ambitious IMEC plan in bid to counter China. Prime Minister Narendra Modi held crucial bilateral talks with U.S. President Donald Trump in Washington on Friday. Both leaders discussed ranges of issues such as civil nuclear energy, defense deals, and working closely on strategic IMEC corridor. Addressing media in the East Room of the White House, both leaders sounded positive on the outcome of the discussion, which, as per the Ministry of External Affairs, went on for 4 hours. And the development of the India, Middle Eastern, European economic corridor, President Trump called it the greatest trade route in all of history. The initiative, which was launched in 2023 in the margins of the G20 summit in New Delhi, is seen as an answer to China's Belt and Road Initiative. The U.S. is one of the signatories of the plan and will help in building this corridor, President Trump reiterated during the White House briefing. Running from India to Israel to Italy and onward to the U.S., the IMEC corridor will connect our partners, the U.S. President added. As part of the plan, roads and railway routes, along with undersea cable networks, will be developed, President Trump said. So, obviously, the UAE and its support for the expulsion of the Palestinians in Gaza, it makes a lot of sense when you think about this corridor, which has to go right through Gaza, eventually perhaps to Cyprus, through Greece, into Europe. And, perhaps they could even connect that to a U.S.-controlled Greenland. And we really do have this truly global network that, they're trying to get to, as the headline said, counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, which they succeeded so far doing in the Panama Canal. I know they are trying to succeed in by putting in a liberal government in Myanmar and all these other places. So again, that's another thing that the Trump, Hegseth, Rubio, defense and state apparatus is doing, is toning things down in Ukraine so they can shift, of course, towards supporting Israel's potential war with Iran, or rather likely war with Iran that they're going to drag us into, as well as U.S. confrontation with China over Taiwan and over all these other issues in the South Pacific where, China is making moves, accusing Australia even of imposing on their territory. So all of this is very much World War III coded. Listen to our episode with George McMillan where we talk about this deep energy stuff and how it ties in with literally every front in the ongoing Third World War, of course, with Russia, China, the US, and then Israel and its enemy Iran as the major, centers of conflict and players on this chessboard right now. But unless you have anything to say about all of that, Dimitri, we do have some updates in Libya, and then we also have to talk about what's going on in the U.S., because Trump, not only is U.S. aid being funded, but the NED is now being funded, and, some new Senate confirmations just happened. So let us know what's going on in Libya, and of course, your thoughts on, the IMEC situation and Russia's new Red Sea port.
Yeah, one of the really tense stories from Libya, again, is the uncovering of more than 50 bodies from mass graves in the southeastern desert. Actually, these are the areas controlled by the Supreme Commander of the National Army of Libya, General Field Marshal Haftar, right, who has held power in Libya. In a large portion of Libya, he's Russia-backed, and he's held power in Libya since 2015, so 10 years going into it now. And essentially the really weird peace situation in Libya that's happening now is it's walking the fine end of a knife, and essentially both sides are waiting to accuse one another of breaching some sort of Libyan interest. It's really interesting that most of the refugees, these sub-Saharan, mostly African refugees, these aren't really native Libyans themselves who are traveling north through the Libyan desert in order to reach Europe, Conrad. They are being stopped, and there was actually accusations thrown at Field Marshal Haftar in December of 2023 that his particular militias and brigades were stopping these refugees, either killing them or putting them into very, shall we say, inhumane concentration camps, so-called detention centers for refugees, for immigrants, and attempting to process them. And mind you, these sub-Saharan Africans traveling north typically don't carry any documents on them, so it's quite confusing as to which nation they came from and etc. So Haftar at the moment is going to face criticism, I think, from the world as the story develops. This from the 9th of February that there are these mass graves uncovered in his particular zone under his so-called control. And it's, again, questionable as to who exactly is killing these people and burying them in these mass graves in the desert, because it could be not even Haftar's troops or militias. These could be just literally human smugglers and these slave traders who've been operating in Libya since the NATO intervention of 2011 and the breakdown of that entire nation. So this is a particular front of the world conflict, I think, Conrad, that will continue to sort of increase in dimension, especially now that we see Russian interests put at risk in Syria and essentially reduced to a severe minimum. And Russia now looks towards having another particular area on the coast of the Mediterranean where they could potentially stop their ships and they could fund and perhaps even build up looking into the future. So Russia is standing behind Field Marshal Haftar. That makes a lot of sense, especially given the fact that he can speak fluent Russian. It does kind of assist in that bilateral relationship. But we have to keep in mind Libya is not under the control of Field Marshal Haftar. It's in a state of a very soon approaching hot civil war, which will probably break down in a similar way to Syria. So Libya is one of the fronts which, again, we look at in a similar fashion to the Congo, the Somaliland situation, and of course Sudan, which is probably one of the hottest conflicts, I think, in recent place. And Mali, of course, we can never really forget there's still Wagner fighting there in the Sahel belt, again, fiercely fighting against the, in this case, radical Islamic rebels and Tuareg Islamic natives. So it's quite a complex situation up there north of the Sahara Desert and in the Sahel belt. But Libya in particular, Conrad, I think is one of those places where we'll hear a lot more news as 2025 develops, and we'll keep covering all of the details there.
Yeah, Africa, of course, has many fronts, and of course, the current one in DRC is very similar to the supposed African world wars we saw in the 90s and early 20th century. So, going to be watching all of that very closely, and of course, it ties in with the major resource wars that undergird all of this. But Africa, of course, is also a place that has unfortunately been a victim not just of U.S. aid, but the National Endowment for Democracy and Donald Trump. This is from Dave DeCamp. The Trump administration has frozen funding to the National Endowment for Democracy, the NED, a U.S.-funded organization that meddles in elections and pushes regime change around the world in the name of promoting democracy. According to the Free Press, an order from Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, to the U.S. Treasury Department that blocks the disbursement of funds to the NED and has crippled the organization's activities. It's been a bloodbath, an NED staffer told the FP. We have not been able to meet payroll and pay basic overhead expenses. The NED, which was founded during the Cold War in 1983, receives $315 million from the U.S. government for the 2025 fiscal year, according to the report. In 1991, Alan Weinstein, a co-founder of the NED, acknowledged to the Washington Post that a lot of what the organization did was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. So this is going to be a big blow to U.S. soft power as well, especially, neoliberal soft power, which, is a very good thing. And, some other good news on the U.S. home front, of course, is the confirmation of Tulsi Gabbard as the Director of National Intelligence and the confirmation of RFK Jr. as the Secretary of Health and Human Services. Both were confirmed by a 52-48 vote in the Senate, which was surprising. I actually thought they would have to be confirmed with a 50-50 vote and a J.D. Vance tiebreaker, just like Pete Hegseth. Of course, Mitch McConnell, who also voted against Hegseth, voted against both of them. He is completely turned against Trump and the base of the Republican Party, full rhino. But, this is very good. Of course, I don't know how effective Tulsi Gabbard is going to be. And unfortunately, in his confirmation hearing, RFK Jr. called Operation Warp Speed, a miracle, a wonderful operation, all these sorts of stupid things, which again, I would rather he say those things and get confirmed than, stand on principles and not get the job. But, how much is he really going to do is the question. And I think, unfortunately, I do think he will be able to do a lot. And a good sign of this was Trump recently, he said this with, at RFK's confirmation, he said, not long ago, 1 in 10,000 children had autism. Now it's 1 in 36. Who can believe that? There's something wrong. And I think it's something that can be found out. And of course, RFK Jr. has worked a lot with Del Bigtree and others who have, exposed the reality that a lot of these vaccines, specifically the adjuvants in, MMR vaccines and a lot of other vaccines that are in the mandatory vaccination regimen for kids, at hospitals and whatnot, that they do cause autism. They do cause food allergies, of which I myself am a victim. So this is really good to see. And if, HHS and the government can actually get a bit of a handle on the big pharma regime and the vaccine cartel and, the scam that is vaccine court and all this kind of stuff, that would be wonderful. Perhaps we'll reach out to Del Bigtree and get him on an Ether Hour to discuss the vaccine issue. Everybody be sure to leave comments across the internet about World War Now. If people that you want to see on the show, if, there's guests that you like, let the world know about us so that we can talk to more and more people. But No, it's really good to see some of these confirmations. I actually really didn't think RFK Jr. was ever going to get this role. I believe on the show I even countersignaled the idea and even made fun of it in the past. So I'm eating my words in a very good way on all of this. However, the deportations issue regarding, Trump's success is not going well. They're barely able to get like 500 people deported a day. And again, as I've said before, we need at least 6,000, in reality at least 15,000 to really be 15,000 people deported a day to really be making a difference, specifically, regardless, considering that Biden let 10 million in his, tenure. Wow. However, border crossings are at an all-time low. We are hearing of a lot of reports of self-deportations. And with the dismantling of, USAID and a lot of these other things, and the U.S. reorienting itself towards, a more Monroe Doctrine, Western Hemisphere focus, we're empowering governments and people like Nayib Bukele. So a lot of Salvadorans are returning to El Salvador because it's been, restored as a country that enforces law and order. And there's even that huge Salvadoran prison that Trump has even threatened to send illegal immigrants to. It's supposedly basically the worst prison in the world, 40,000 people there. And you basically have no rights. You can't visit anybody. You have to talk in a whisper. Everybody just sleeps on metal beds. And if you talk out of line, they throw you in the brig, which is just dark with a stone slab to sleep on. So, if more and more people are at least afraid of the law and order and are self-deporting, then that's a good sign as well. Unfortunately, it doesn't appear that however many funny memes that Tom Homan and, DHS and the White House post, the deportations need to increase. We got to be sending families, kids, these people got to go. And I don't care where you arrest them. You got to get them out of this country. But one of the most sinister admissions, and this isn't directly tied to USAID or NED, I'm sure behind the scenes it is, but Antony Blinken recently admitted just very overtly that the U.S. government, his State Department under the Biden regime, explicitly pushed gay marriage on Greece. They explicitly said that, let me just have the official quote here. In a speech, he openly discusses, promoting LGBTQ rights in Greece and how they, talked about applying diplomatic pressure, which I'm assuming in the case of Greece means, access to U.S. jets and weapons and air defenses, of which, or even, perhaps not selling Turkey U.S. jets and weapons and air defenses. Of course, also, Greece is one of the most indebted EU nations, so the amount of pressure that could be put on them for, they have one of the heaviest tax burdens, their middle class isn't able to grow, and they're always sort of in a bit of a precarious position on that, so the amount of pressure the U.S. can provide is immense. So unfortunately, that is obviously why Greece is the first Orthodox country to cave to the issue of sodomite marriage. And I don't know how they're going to claw that back. There's nothing that the Trump administration can do. This is in the hands of the Greek people at this point. But if the Greeks were smart, they would take this video from Blinken, put it up everywhere, say we were victims of a ploy, of a demonic, of a demonic plot, and we must restore order. And I hope that something like that can happen. But if NED is defunded, if USAID maintains its defunded status, then, stuff like that could happen without the potential of, astroturfed leftist protests and color revolutions emerging. A lot of these traditional countries can, become who they need to be. But with all of that in mind, Dimitri, what is going on with the situation in Ukraine? I know there are persecutions going on in Estonia that I'll talk about as well, but, the war against the church really never ends.
No, absolutely not. And, we do have the names of certain culprits, just like last week we discussed Archpriest Vladislav Tsipin, who officially, went away into the schism in 2024, but he was one of the main, I suppose, archpriests, lower ranks of clergy who actually advocated for Ukrainian autocephaly, autonomy, and wanted to bring the church under the ecumenical patriarchate or even disconnect it from Russia entirely. And we did mention how essentially schisms first commence in the minds of these people, and then years later they work on their delusions. And in a similar fashion, this revelation came from Metropolitan Alexander Drabinko, who was the secretary at some point of the previous Metropolitan before Metropolitan Onufri. That's Metropolitan Vladimir Slobodan, who passed away prior to COVID. And of course, Metropolitan Onufri took over. And so Alexander Drabinko went into the newly formed OCU schism. In fact, he's, you can say, the right-hand man of Seryoja Epiphany Demenko. And Drabinko, in fact, I call him Metropolitan, but he essentially should be, frankly, defrocked. And in fact, he is anathematized by any sort of imagination for persecuting the church. Alexander Drabinko is one of the hierarchs of the schismatic OCU, responsible directly for organizing these militias to take over churches, to essentially militarize the Ukrainian state against the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church. He's one of the main culprits. And in this interview in oboz.ua, he gave a very interesting revelation. He essentially said that Vladislav this archpriest gave him the idea that in 2007, that Vladimir Slobodan, the metropolitan at the time, should strive towards autocephaly or to gain autonomy for the Ukrainian church, potentially more independence from Moscow by siding with the ecumenical patriarch at the time. And mind you, the ecumenical patriarch in 2007 was still Patriarch Bartholomew. So it's very interesting how the roots of this particular schism and issue and all we see in Ukraine potentially goes back further, but we do know the culprits of it today. And it's interesting revelations from Alexander Drabinko here. And I'm not saying Metropolitan of Vladimir was wrong in some potential ways, but there was this den of vipers, this sort of nest of scorpions hiding within the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church prior to the 2018 schism. And they were simply waiting for an excuse, a pretext to disconnect themselves and to side with anyone who isn't Russian, essentially. So these are, you can almost call them church activists in some way. Again, as we now understand, completely supported by George Soros and USAID and all these other degenerate NGOs. So that's sort of a big revelation. And to sort of counteract that, in fact, the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill himself, of course, releases a patriarchal calendar every single year around February. And the calendar for 2025 has an entire section dedicated to the Russian hierarchs of Ukraine, of the autonomous Ukrainian Orthodox Church, believe it or not, Conrad. And it's leading with Metropolitan Onufry, Agafangel, has Mark, Sergius, Theodore, Paul, Meletius, Antony, Clement, Metropolitan Luke of Zaporozhye, of course, all the top hierarchs of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, their photographs and their particular standings, which diocese they have management over and administrate. It's all in this patriarchal calendar. So I think the position of Patriarch Kirill and the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church is that the Ukrainian Church remains a part of the Russian Orthodox Church generally. They are not autocephalous. They are not autonomous in any particular capacity, regardless of what, say, maybe a lot of pro-Zelensky and it's funny you say pro-Zelensky because, well, the persecution is currently ongoing and it's frankly being legalized through the Rada and Zelensky's party. But there are hierarchs in the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, the canonical church, which do support the Ukrainian state, and they call the Russian invasion an invasion of pagan tongues, and they name it all kinds of words taken from the Old Testament, essentially. Not necessarily calling Russia Amalek in this particular case, like Benjamin Netanyahu, but they are labeling Russia as a main enemy. And again, they're siding with their particular Ukrainian population. So interesting contrast how Patriarch Kirill is not necessarily willing to give up Russia's control administratively and through church tradition, which goes back literally hundreds of years, because this was all one church united when the faith first came to Kiev, and St. Olga and St. Vladimir were baptized into the Orthodox Church by the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantines, and even before that by Kirill and Methodius. So a lot of interesting contrasts going on there. So this is the secret signals that are taking place and arriving from Moscow to Kiev, perhaps, in the discourse between these hierarchs. And the other, of course, interaction we saw recently, Conrad, was on the 11th of February, there was a big conference below the Church of Christ the Savior Cathedral in that massive hall. Patriarch Kirill opened up discussing, of course, the SMO and the current church situation, logistics, all these really complex issues. The Russian church has, since his tenureship as patriarch, has expanded in size dramatically. There are over 400 bishops in the Russian Orthodox Church now, making it the jurisdiction with the most bishops in the Orthodox world. Almost half of the world's bishops are members of the Russian church now. And so this particular discussion had a Q&A section, like an FAQ at the end. And the priest, Father Alexei, opened up with he looked like a young priest, but he opened with a very controversial question. He openly asked Patriarch Kirill whether or not, he openly stated, firstly, it wasn't even a question. He said that, look, in my opinion, the position of the church is wrong. Patriotism and the kingdom of heaven are antithetical. They are completely in contrast. They are mutually exclusive. And he brought into question the church's support probably for the SMO. Patriarch Kirill rebukes him and essentially chastises him quite openly. Everyone laughs at the priest. And Patriarch Kirill, I think he was right in the general approach. True patriotism and the position of the Orthodox Church are in fact very compatible. We see this throughout even our own 8th hour episodes regarding Constantine Pobedonosiv, St. John III Vatatzis, the Marble Emperor, even our most episode of 8th hour regarding St. Constantine the Great. You can see that interaction between state actors who are members of the Orthodox Church and the clergy. These two particular groups of people work in tangent in, of course, the church here on earth. Patriotism is a very normal thing for Orthodox Christians. And so the priest was wrong, but I think Patriarch Kirill's first example was a bit inappropriate, Conrad. He did mention, of course, the Second World War and how the Russian church assisted the USSR in defeating the invaders from the West, the Third Reich and all of its allies. And thus, he said the position of the church improved because the Russian church took upon itself this patriotic position. And that's somewhat true, but I think bringing up such a controversial war, in fact, when a lot of hierarchs were just martyred, those in the catacombs who didn't agree with Patriarch Sergiy Starogorodsky in his 1928 concession to the Soviet authorities, right? That famous statement that he made, which a lot of catacomb bishops, such as Saint Kirill of Kazan and Agafangel of Yaroslavl, a lot of these bishops really did not jump on board of Patriarch Sergius's, or Metropolitan Sergius at the time, his statement. And so Patriarch Kirill, I think, brings up this example. Fortunately, he does follow up with some adequate examples of Christian patriotism in the Orthodox tradition, such as Alexander Nevsky, Sergius of Radonezh, Dmitry Donskoy, etc. And the priest is then adequately rebuked. Again, the other priests in the audience laugh at Father Alexei's question. But I think besides the maybe harsh answer, generally Patriarch Kirill, I think his position is correct. And we on the show, we cover this sort of subject matter quite intensely. We've written, articles, me and Conrad, about the position of Orthodox Christianity and warfare. There's 2 particular chapters you can read. They came out quite a while ago, actually, some of the first articles we published on our Substack. So worth reading about that. And notice the persecution has been getting toned down quite a bit, Conrad. We haven't seen any massive abuses, and I think this is because of that looming peace treaty potential, the mediation conferencing, and also the fact that J.D. Vance has this really strong anti-persecution position. But we did see a really unfortunate clip of an Orthodox priest being harassed by this, I'm not even sure if it's his laity, but he was approached by a group of people. They just entered into the church, this gang, and they were led by a woman, and the woman was demanding that the priest hand over the keys from his parish. And this is in the Vinnytska Oblast. It's not in the west, it's literally central Ukraine, just south of Kiev. And this woman was like, hand me the keys to the church, you priest. Give him, you're Russian, you're a Russian priest. And the priest, obviously, because he has to defend all the church goods, he can't simply hand the keys to the home of God to some sort of random woman in this gang of pro-Ukrainian militia. So these particular confrontations are still taking place in little villages. There are over 20,000 parishes across Ukraine. It's a very well-populated Orthodox Christian country, and to this day it still is. And these minor abuses continue to take place, especially with the patronage of the government. And mind you, the Ukrainian police does not come to the aid of the Orthodox Christian priest. This is the danger. When a gang of people walks into the church, the hope is that there are enough Orthodox Christian laypersons, men in particular, altar boys, deacons, who can actually fend off and protect their clergymen in these particular confrontations. So this is the reality on the ground. People are still facing maybe not an intense persecution as during the times of, say, Diocletian and Maximian, but this is a persecution nevertheless, and Orthodox Christians are harassed on a weekly basis. And these stories, they're available in abundance. And the fear is, Conrad, that this same trend will, of course, continue in Estonia very soon, especially with the Estonian government taking a very anti-Orthodox position. Now, most importantly, I think it's the interesting story from this week regarding the wedding of Rabbi Sholom Wolf and Rabbi Ber Lazar's children in Israel. And of course, this particular wedding took place in a West Bank occupied Israeli city. We have the chief rabbi, Rabbi Wolf from Odessa, and the chief rabbi of all of Russia traveling to Israel to celebrate the wedding of their children, alongside of some Russian Jewish rappers, Jigan in particular, who's a member of Timothy's rap group in Russia. These are very Judaizing, degenerate, particular people in the Russian media sphere. They travel to an Israeli city, 2 rabbis from 2 warring countries, to another place, which is currently, again, has been occupied by Israel since the 60s, to celebrate this massive Hasidic elite wedding. And this, I think, flies in the face of the alleged conflict between the nations and the fact that you shouldn't interact. The fact that Ukrainian hierarchs, Conrad, cannot travel to Moscow, for example, for synods and conferences and to hold councils and discuss things with Patriarch Kirill in person, because they would be accused of collaborating, but these rabbis can. There's no restrictions on travel. It's almost as if the war doesn't exist for them, or in fact the war is amongst the Goyim, but the rabbis are definitely not affected by it. And this is really bizarre, because Ber Lazar has in fact supported Putin for the SMO, and Rabbi Wolf was literally one of the rabbis with Zelensky. He was blessing Zelensky on several occasions. When Zelensky was lighting the menorah at Hanukkah, he was there. So this is not some distant rabbi from far. This is one of the head rabbis of all of Ukraine, and yet he's meeting with Ber Lazar. This is a massive conflict of interest, and it shows that these people really are a state within a state, a community operating without any boundaries, and they have their own interest first and foremost. And their interests lie directly in the Holy Land, which they seek to occupy, which they seek to rebuild according to their own future models. And this is, I think, one of these stories which exemplifies these people have zero shame. They're incredibly arrogant. And again, they will weaken the positions of their own respective countries, which they're apparently citizens of, in favor of their own little clique, their cultic communities, and the Talmudic agenda at large.
No, the fear is that, this precedes a sort of Talmudic peace, right? That the negotiations and the eventual ceasefire or peace or concessions that each side give will ultimately be towards the end of, hopefully not something like New Heavenly Jerusalem, which we've discussed on Ether Hour, but even just, freeing up Ukraine and Russia to, in some even moderate capacity, support Israel, provide some form of support for Israel, for Russia to perhaps be pressured to stop supporting Iran, so that, of course, greater Israel can be achieved and Israel's enemies can be destroyed, which is what most foreign policy is all about these days. But of course, you talked about the Estonian Orthodox Church. This is from Ortho Christian. Estonia demands Orthodox Church to change its name, then refuses to register the new name. The Estonian Orthodox Church has changed its name twice in the last several months in response to pressure from the government, which is trying to force it to separate itself from the Moscow Patriarchate. The Estonian Church is an autonomous body within the Patriarchate, meaning that it is self-governed, centered in Tallinn. In August, the Church Council changed the name of the Estonian Orthodox Church Moscow Patriarchate to simply Estonian Orthodox Church, but the Tartu County Court's registration department refused to accept this name, as it is already used by Constantinople's Estonian Apostolic Orthodox Church when presenting itself in other languages, which is, the EP's attempt to do what it's doing in Ukraine in the Baltic states. So, thus, on January 10th, the council adopted the name the Estonian Christian Orthodox Church. However, the registration department has again refused to register the church's new name, claiming it creates the misleading impression the church encompasses all Orthodox Christians in Estonia. At the same time, the court allows Constantinople's church and other religious organizations to use analogous names. We have decided to challenge this refusal in court as we consider it important to defend our rights. The Estonian Church Press Service quotes His Grace Bishop Daniel of Tartu, vicar of His Eminence Metropolitan Evgeny of Tallinn, who was expelled from the country last year on unsubstantiated claims that he posed a security threat. The registry department's refusal to register the name the Estonian Christian Orthodox Church raises questions about equal treatment, considering that several religious organizations with similar names are officially registered in Estonia. Examples include the Estonian Charismatic Episcopal Church, the Estonian Charismatic Fellowship Church, the Estonian Full Gospel Church, the Estonian Evangelical Lutheran Church, the New Apostolic Church in Estonia, and the Estonian Apostolic Orthodox Church. So, of course, it's obvious just discrimination against the true canonical Church of Estonia, trying to facilitate all sorts of schismatics and Constantinople-backed groups. But, of course, we pray for Metropolitan Evgeny, the other bishops there that have been persecuted, because, frankly, a lot of people have been talking about how Russia should just go in and take these countries out. They're just, from a NATO Western perspective, all they do is advocate for their ethnic grievance against the Russians. And then for the Russians, they're just a front line for NATO to launch an attack. So I say just, take them out, either cut them in half, make them form their own little confederation on the North Sea, or just take them all and allow them to be, self-governing regions within the Russian Federation that can't pose, an internal military threat. That's my perspective. But that's pretty much the last stories we have today, Dimitri. Do you have any thoughts on the Estonia situation? And if not, any final thoughts on this week's World War III, events?
I think, Conrad, it's been an incredibly eventful week. The diplomacy discussions, Putin, Israel, Trump, Iran, all of these massive talks happening behind the scenes, and we're not given all of the details. So here we are, of course, speculating, analyzing all the news and how it may all tie together. And beyond all of this is the concerns of the Orthodox Christians in places like Estonia, the Baltic states, again, Lithuania and Latvia as well will probably follow suit. And I completely agree with you. And we did see certain posts online that these Baltic states are essentially the front lines of NATO. They serve no real purpose. They don't even propagate their own culture, really, in their own respective states. They don't promote Lutheranism or Catholicism. They just promote NATOism and liberal degeneracy, essentially this neoliberal foreign policy. And they exist simply as Russophobic client states. In fact, their leaderships are, as we see in the face of Kalas, for example, they're not even Estonian Baltic elites of any sort. They're not related to the Teutonic Knights or any of the great heroes of the Baltic state histories. They're not Baltic German nobility by any stretch. These are just weird, kleptocratic pseudo-oligarchs who run these particular countries on the behest of NATO. And again, especially in the Baltic states, it's the ever-present support of the United Kingdom, which I think many Russian analysts have stated that the Baltic states in particular, it is the fiefdom of the UK, of the Rothschild-run city of London in particular, not just the US. It's like this Baltic region, in particular, and that entire Northern Sea area is under the influence of London. And we understand that's one of the dens of the enemies of Christianity since time immemorial. Unfortunately, since the English people have been used as a weapon against Christianity for centuries now. So there's a lot of consideration going into this persecution. It isn't an isolated case. In fact, I think, as you'll probably agree, I think pessimistically speaking, it is the beginning perhaps of something that will lead, hopefully, towards a further maybe military operation or maybe a special diplomatic operation that will free up the Christians in Syria after, again, a full-on, fully fledged persecution takes place in these particular areas, which were natively Christian. By the way, Estonia was Christianized by none other than Yaroslav the Wise, who was a saint in the Orthodox Church. He's a son of Saint Vladimir of Kiev, the half-brother of Saints Boris and Gleb. So Estonia has been an Orthodox Christian country from literally the time of Russia's baptism. So there's a lot to consider in these particular interactions. They are striking at the heart of Orthodox Christianity in Eastern Europe. It's not just these lands which were so-called occupied by so-called USSR and Bolshevism or the evil imperialistic tsars. These lands have always had Orthodox Christians living in them, and even before the Russian Church had autocephaly when it was under the ecumenical patriarch. So, but these people will never tell you that, which is why it's important, I think, to listen to these sort of shows, which we cover these news more or less unbiasedly and give you some of this background detail as to why the elites make the decisions that they make.
Now, that's a good way to end it. I want to let everybody know that we have some really fantastic interviews coming up with Cameron McGregor from The Backlash. We're going to be talking to Alexander Dugin soon, Steve Hassou, Father Peter Hears as well. So be sure to get behind the paywall to catch the full versions of all of these Ether Hour conversations that we are going to have. And all of that can be done at worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. That is our home base. Both of those links work. And you can get behind that paywall for just $7 a month, get access to all of our Ether Hour episodes. At this point, it's hundreds and hundreds of hours of content. You also get access to our monthly Q&A threads where we can answer your questions in those Q&A Ether Hour episodes. You also get access to the premium channels on the Discord where we can talk to you directly, answer questions, get in voice chat and do all sorts of interesting stuff. So if you support the show, if you like what we're doing here, please get behind that paywall. It helps keep the lights on here in the World War Now bunker, as it were. But if you want to follow us on social media, be sure to follow us on X at World War Now _. Follow me on there at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at World War Now Host. That's right. He has a new @ I can't believe I didn't forget. First time I've gotten it correct. So follow him at WWN Host. Be sure to follow us on Telegram at World War Now Telly. You can subscribe to the YouTube channel World War Now. Please help us get over 5,000 subscribers on there. I'm also going to be starting my new live stream probably this week. So be sure to follow us on X and YouTube for that. My new microphone is being used. You're hearing me use it as I speak right now. So hopefully the World War Live, as I think I'm going to call it, stream will be up and running this week or next week. So be sure to check that out. I want to see a lot of people in the chat, letting me know what they want me to talk about. So with all of that, thank you so much for supporting the show. Be sure to pray for peace in all of these regions. Pray for unity among the Orthodox Church and keep Dimitri and I in your prayers as well. So thank you so much for listening and God bless. We will see you on the next one.